Welcome, medical assisting students. My name is Bonnie Moore. I am full-time faculty in the Health Information Technology program here at Rasmussen University. I'm going to be presenting for you today a medical assisting preventative care worksheet and an AAMA exam review. So let's go ahead and get started. First, we're going to do a review of the definitions that you'll find used on your AAMA exam. Sorry for that. I'm used to our abbreviations in HIT, and we have AMA instead of AAMA. So excuse me for dropping an A now and then. So let's take a look at some terms that are going to be important for you to understand. The coding and abstracting systems is what we use in the coding and billing world. And bottom line, coding and abstracting systems basically get the bills paid for a facility, a provider, surgical center, hospital, home health care, ER, any of that type of patient care. So these are systems designed to convey information from provider documentation to the payer, whether it be Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, which is military, or any other insurance. Basically, in the coding world and in the billing world, there are three main systems that provide what we call a billable language, which will be codes from the patient healthcare record. So technically a coder is a translator of provider documentation into billable code language that an insurance company will understand. And as you combine these codes under certain, guidelines and rules, then what happens is it comes up with a formula in which these codes are used, and that formula determines the bill. So I wanted you to be aware that these three, the first one, which is in the dark highlight, is ICD-10-CM, and this is only diagnosis codes used in both inpatient and outpatient coding. The reason they are used in both is because these are the codes that prove medical necessity for whatever is being done or whatever service is provided, the x-ray that's being done, the lab that's being done, because an insurance company will not pay if medical necessity is not proven. So that's what a CM code does. They're just called diagnosis codes, and again, used for both inpatient and outpatient. So the ICD-10 PCS is only procedure codes, and these are used only for inpatient procedures. So a patient would have to be in the hospital, or they would have to be maybe even in an outpatient surgical center for over 24 hours. Or it could also be a rehab center that is called on-site inpatient. So that would be ICD-10 PCS. CPT is what you would probably be most exposed to as a medical assistant. And these are only procedure and provider service codes. These are used only for outpatient services and procedures. So this would be, they would be very typically used in a patient's office visit. So those are the three main systems. Let's talk first about CPT codes, because that's the one you will be most exposed to in a physician office setting. Again, used only for outpatient procedures. There must be documentation on the medical record to use a code, and the documentation must match what's called the code description provided in the code book. And the code description is what's written right after the code. And it tells you exactly what that code is translating from the provider documentation. So the bottom line is that code description has to match the provider documentation. Now, it's not always going to be word for word, and that's where understanding the guidelines, understanding medical terminology comes in very handy to a coder, because you understand that, for example, a lot of providers still use the word cancer. Well, in CM coding, cancer is not used. It's called a malignant neoplasm. So your neoplasm is what you will start looking for, and then it's malignant, which means it's cancerous. So there's times when you have to look for what means the same when finding the code. I did want to make this note to you. CPT and what's called HCPCS, HCPCS, are the only coding systems that use modifiers at the end of a code. And I'm going to explain to you HCPCS, because that's a minor coding system. It's not, one of the top 3 main ones. But here's an example. Let's say the CPT code is 99285, and then you put a hyphen and then a modifier. This you'll see a lot in physician office coding. Medicare requires certain modifiers to be used at certain incidences. It basically provides additional information as needed. Either the location or there's something different about the service. For example, if they have 2 things done in one day, that requires a modifier, because Medicare needs to know that you understand that 2 different visits were done on the same day. Otherwise, they're going to come back and question that. So there's certain reasons to use modifiers. Another could be to indicate, if it's right side or left side, or if it's bilateral. You can also use it if there's a procedure being done and a physician does the first half and another physician does the second half. So that's an indicator that as the coder and as the billing department, you are aware to the insurance company that there's something a little different here. So let's take a look at CM coding for diagnosis. Again, only diagnosis codes. And CM is important in that it is the one system used in both inpatient and outpatient. It is the code that proves medical necessity, as we just talked about. And again, if medical necessity is not proven, according to coding guidelines, according to insurance criteria, the billing will be denied. So the CM codes must be legal, which means they have to follow guidelines that are, all coders learn. They must be accurate, which means they're coded to the greatest degree of specificity, which means that you're not just coding it generally, you're getting as specific as possible as far as the actual code book will allow you. And they must be complete. If a coder drops even one character in a code, the code becomes invalid. And of course, the code is based on provider documentation, coding guidelines, and there's something called instructional notes found on the tabular list in a CM code book. And if you don't follow these to the T as a coder, the insurance company, I can guarantee you, will deny the claim, because they're really looking for any way to do that. So that's why coding requires, a lot of education, a lot of detail work, and being very accurate. So the CM code book contains both an alphabetic index and what I want you to be aware of is there's sections in the CM code book, because the CM code book, either your instructor has given you the code book at this point or will be when we look up codes, but I want you to be aware of how it's organized. You won't be dealing with a CPT code book or a PCS code book. We're just going to look at diagnosis codes for your exam. So there's an alphabetic index, which is more toward the front of the code book. That's where you can quickly look up the diagnosis, get the general code, which is called the directive code, and then that's going to direct the coder to where to look up the code, what code to start with in what's called the tabular list, which is to the last half of the book. So there's two different sections you're using to actually locate the code. And we'll talk through that more in detail as we actually look up some codes. So all CM coding must be finalized to the accurate and legal code from the tabular list. So what that means is when you're looking up that directive code that directs you where to go in the tabular list, you cannot code from the alphabetic, because that is not always the most accurate and specific code. So the tabular list is what gives you all the information to finalize your code and make it legal. We mentioned before HCPCS. This is called level 2. It's a minor coding system, and it's used only when a code from the CPT coding system does not include certain supplies and equipment in the code. And this is why it was created later by Medicare, because sometimes the codes did not really give a true representation of the cost of everything, especially when it came to needing to cover things like oxygen tent tubing, crutches, different types of support equipment for a patient. So HCPCS then becomes an added coding system that will provide additional details to facility bills to ensure, full payment to the facility. So let's talk about linking procedure and diagnosis codes, because even though we're not going to look up procedure codes, it's important to understand on your exam, and for billing, how this works. So basically in a billing form, again, it's what's called medical necessity for the service. But you start with that CM diagnosis code that does prove it's medically necessary to do the service procedure or use the equipment used. It then has to link to either a PCS or CPT code that's used to describe the service procedure or equipment used. It has to match, and it has to make sense, and it has to give a valid reason why. In the billing form, there's a link. When the code is sent to billing, it automatically links in the software system to the diagnosis code. It links the diagnosis code to the procedure code. If that link doesn't work, as far as it doesn't make sense or match, what will happen is when the billing department puts that billing form through what's called it's actually called a billing scrubber, like you're scrubbing something clean, and it's software that puts that bill through and gives red flags if something isn't matching or linking, or a code is invalid, or there's something like a modifier that needs to be added and wasn't used. So that's why linking procedure and diagnosis codes is so important. in a bill. So again, let's just kind of look at what modifiers are, because modifiers are used in CPT, in a lot of physician office coding. So a modifier is always 2-character. It can be letter or number, and it's added at the end, like we, said with that hyphen. And that then indicates that there's more detail and needed information for billing and to the insurance company. So here's what it's going to look like. The hyphen and 50, that means this particular code is describing something that was done bilaterally, and the actual code would not indicate that one way or the other. Or if it was just done on the right side, it would be hyphen right. If it was just on the left side, it will be hyphen left. It's all describing the same procedure, but that modifier is telling the billing department and the insurance company, this is where it was done. Just so you're aware, the modifier choices are found actually in the front cover of a CPT code book. They're all listed there and what they mean. So if you ever get a chance to see a CPT code book, just flip the front cover and look inside it, and all those codes will be there. And you'll have to excuse me for needing to take drinks because my throat is not in optimal condition today. So thank you for putting up with my taking a drink now and then to keep talking to you. So the outpatient coding terms that you will need to be familiar with on the AAMA exam, I got it. One is called bundling of charges. It's a category of payments called bundled payments. What that means is it's paid as a lump sum, and it includes various services delivered over a specific period of time or a specific illness. It can include multiple providers or one. So an example would be a surgical procedure and a follow-up physician office visits to monitor recovering and healing. So this would be, it's very typical, like of a hysterectomy. And it includes, some pre-check, some post visits to monitor how is the recovery going, but it's all lumped within the one code for a hysterectomy. Upcoding is when a coder uses diagnosis or procedure codes that represent higher payment than indicated by coding guidelines. And that is basically illegal. Sometimes a coder can do it on purpose, or they can do it accidentally if they're not familiar with certain guidelines. This involves using more codes than the guidelines indicate for increased payment, or sometimes you're using a definitive diagnosis code instead of the sign or symptom code, and the diagnosis code, which has not been proven yet, indicates a higher level of payment, when all you can use by coding guidelines would be that sign and symptom code, which is less payment. And another example would be, we call it unbundling. Instead of bundling up the charges, you're breaking them all apart into individual codes instead of one code. And when you do that, it actually adds up to a higher level of bill. And so if the guidelines indicate it's a bundled payment and the coder breaks it down into all separate codes, that again is illegal. So let's look at CPT coding for provider office visits and services. You need to, be aware of this so that you're aware of how CPT codes work, especially a type, and you can see it here in the slide, it's E/M, and that's under the second bullet point there. And in the coding world, in the provider office world, in all outpatient services world, they're just called E&M codes. So I want you to be clear on that, because you may hear that phrase. What's the E&M code for that? Or can you figure out the E&M code for that? It's the whole long term is evaluation and management. So as a medical assistant, it's the type of coding you're going to see mainly in provider office visits and services. And the main category of CPT codes you will see are called E&M codes. And it can be either for office visits, or if your provider is called to do a hospital visit, even though they're not the actual provider overseeing the hospital care, sometimes the outpatient provider, the family physician, the nurse practitioner could be called in when the patient is in the hospital, or it can be consultations. They're asked to consult. So as a medical assistant, you will mainly deal with provider office visits and office services. So if you are required to enter a CPT code for office visits, you do need to be aware that there are terms and guidelines to follow when you look up a CPT code in a book. And the system for looking CPT codes up will be different than what we cover when we look up diagnosis codes in that ICD-10 CM code book. But I did want you to be aware, if you're on the job, sometimes they'll give you what in the coding world we call a cheat sheet, which means there's certain things they do all the time, and these are the codes that you just put in, so you don't even have to look them up in a code book. However, what a lot of providers are not aware is these codes are updated in the coding world October 1st of every year. So you want to be aware that around that time, if your provider is not aware of updates that happen every year in CPT coding, that's something you might want to research and look up, or see if you can get a hold of the new code book, because it does every year they put out a new code book. So I wanted you to be aware of how that system worked and how it affects physician office visits. So here are some CPT codes that you're going to need to know, and especially in E&M coding, these are really important. So professional services are basically face-to-face services between a provider and patient. They are reported using those E&M codes, but you always have to have those CM diagnosis codes to prove medical necessity. In E&M coding, you always have to determine, is this a new patient or is an established patient, because that'll make a difference in the code. And the reason being, a new patient is obviously going to take more time because they have to collect data from the patient. And a new patient is technically one who has not seen the provider or a provider that's within the same specialty, like if they're in a physician group, or subspecialty within the last 3 years. So if they have within those 3 years, then they're an established patient. Now, an exception to the rule is if a patient is seen by a provider on call for their regular provider, then it's the same guideline used as though the provider were the patient's regular provider. And just so you know, when we use the word provider now in coding, and I'm kind of assuming it may be the same in medical assisting, a provider is not only a doctor, but they could be, you know, a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant. And so therefore, the same codes are used, the same as a doctor would use. So now we've lumped it all together in a provider as an overarching term. So let's look at components of a patient chart. These are usually stated in a patient's own words. So it's called a chief complaint. What did they come in with? Why did they schedule this appointment? So it's a concise statement in the documentation of the patient chart describing what are the symptoms, any other problems, has there actually been a diagnosis, any prior conditions, or any other factors as the reason for the encounter, especially if it's like an injury, you know, what caused the injury? Are there any other extenuating diagnosis, like, you know, are they diabetic? Do they have any kind of like high blood pressure? Do they have COPD? Those type of things that impact would be under the chief complaint, and they would also usually be located in what's called the history and physical in an outpatient chart. So here are the following components of a patient chart that you actually use in E&M coding. And you'll hear this term also called leveling. It determines the level of care given in the patient encounter by the provider. I mean, now they do it also a lot by the amount of time that the provider takes. That's newer, I think, within the last 3 to 4 years. But you're still having to, in an E&M code, take into consideration these factors. First of all, that provider has to understand the patient history. They have to indicate the type of examination, new or established. Is this a consultation? Is it a hospital visit? Then there's something also called medical decision making. What is the level? That's a key determining factor in a E&M code. It depends on the depth of it, how many, and how recent. Is it new? Is it something that we already have previous medical decisions made? So those are the 3 top key determining factors when doing, you know, that E&M code. Those also tend to factor into the time. The more complicated, the more patient history, the more involved the examination, obviously, the longer the time. And that's going to impact the leveling of the code. And then what can also impact the level is, did they do counseling around, say, palliative care? Did they coordinate care with another provider, another facility? Did they go more in depth on the nature of the presenting problem? And of course, then what we talked about, how much time was involved. So all those factors, when a coder determines the level of the code in an E&M code, all those go into consideration. Okay, so those are the basic definitions that are going to be used on your AAMA exam. So I wanted you to be aware of those and kind of understand them, not only in the context of your medical assisting world, but a little bit in the context of the coding and billing world. So now, if your instructor hasn't done this already, we're going to practice a few ICD-10 CM codes, looking them up from the code book, because these are on a test that you're going to have. So this way you can know how to look them up, and we're going to find the codes. So if the instructor wants to pause this and hand out the books, please do that. And otherwise I will continue. So what we're following in this part of the presentation is your table 2, which is your exam diagnosis to code. And so your exam is actually asking you to find these codes. There's 6 of them. And these are often seen on a patient's chart in the problem list. We are going to walk through how to find these 6 codes in the code book, which your instructor has now provided you in class. And I'm going to be walking you through how to locate these codes in the code book. And your instructor is going to pause this video as needed, because some students take longer than others to find it. That's perfectly normal. But that way you can pause until you've completed, that part of the coding pathway that we're looking up. So please know that there is a process that a coder goes through to locate the diagnosis code. And this is what I'm going to be walking you through in that process. And that way you kind of have a general idea of how to look up basic diagnosis codes. So before we start looking them up, I'm going to use some terminology that you need to know, or you're not going to understand what you're looking at. So obviously the CM code book is what you have in front of you, or you're sharing with someone. Remember, we mentioned the alphabetic index. That's in part 2 of your code book, and you're going to have different looking code books, different years, and there's different distributors of code books. So even though they may look different on the cover, they might look a little different on the inside, these particular parts of the code book remain the same no matter who publishes it, no matter who puts it together. So in the front part of your code book is called the alphabetic index. Remember, we talked about that's where you find that initial code. So the part 2 of your code book, called the alphabetic index, is found after the section called coding guidelines. So first you want to locate in your code book the alphabetic index, because this is where you're going to start locating the diagnosis you're looking for. There are other indexes, but we're looking, it's called the alphabetic, or the diagnosis index, and everything is in alphabetic order. That's why it's called alphabetic. So what we always start with when we're looking in the alphabetic is called the main term, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Then after you've found, we call that the directive code, you take that directive code from the alphabetic and go find it in what's called the tabular list. And that's part 3 of a code book. It's found after all the different indexes. And most code books, there's like a bar on the side of each page that has, it's colored, and it's color coordinated by chapters. And so on the tabular list, you're going to see 22 chapters. And this is part 3 of a code book. And then each chapter covers specific codes based on the type of diagnosis or based on injury by body location. You're not going to be dealing with injury. We're just basically doing, problem list diagnosis. So the main term, that's the medical diagnosis term that you use to begin locating the code. It has to match the documentation provided. It has to prove medical necessity. The main term is always going to be the most general description of that diagnostic group. And when we walk this through, you'll see what that is. But it's like, let's say you have acute appendicitis. Well, the main general term, medical term, is appendicitis. The acute is what we call the subterm, because here, if you'll notice in the definition, if a diagnosis has more than one medical term, you need more than just the main term. You've got to now get more specific. So acute appendicitis is our diagnosis, but now we're looking for acute, or it could be gangrene. It could be perforated. But the core general term is the main term, appendicitis. A subterm is any other details added to make it more specific. Okay, so let's start looking at finding a code in the code book. These are the steps that we're talking about here. And we're going to walk through each of the problem list diagnosis that you're going to be coding. I'm going to walk you through coding or determining the main term and then a subterm if needed. And then you're going to take that main term to the alphabetic, and we're going to locate your main term alphabetically. If it has more than one term, then you have to locate the subterms. So steps 1 to 5 are basically what's called looking up the directive code in the alphabetic, because that's the code that's going to direct you where to look in the tabular list to get the final code. So you're going to use the directive code located in the tabular list. And just so you know, the first letter of the directive code, because they always start with a letter, it's going to tell you which chapter to go to, because those chapters each contain codes with certain letters. Most of them just have one letter, some of them have 2, and there's a total of 22 chapters. So each chapter has the codes for that chapter, and they're all, after the letter, they're in numerical order. So they're pretty easy to locate that way. Once you find the chapter, then you locate the number. And just so you know, CM codes can be anywhere from 3 to 7 characters, no more than 7, no less than 3. And then when you find that code, you have to make sure that the code description for that code matches your documentation. Okay, so let's put this all into action. And again, your instructor is going to pause this video as needed. I mean, I'm going to be talking you through it, but that way you can take the time you need to look it up. So the first problem list diagnosis we start with, number 1, the problem is renal hypertension. This came from the patient problem list, needs to be translated into a billable code. because the provider will be addressing this problem and obviously needs to be paid for their service. So when we look at renal hypertension, we have to find the main term, and the most general term is hypertension. So that is the main term. So now you're going to go to your alphabetic list, locate this term alphabetically, and if you'll notice under it, there's a lot of indentations of many code options, because hypertension can have renal indications, it can have heart issue applications. There can be pregnancy hypertension. So, but we're starting with hypertension. Our subterm here is renal. So renal is the type, and that narrows down our search in the alphabetic. And all subterms are also listed alphabetically. So they're indented from the main term. So follow down under hypertension and find renal, and it tells us to see kidney. Under kidney, it narrows it down further to kidney with stage 1 to 5, because chronic kidney disease, they stage it. In our documentation, it doesn't indicate the stage, so we assume it's within 1 to 5, because if it was end-stage renal disease, which is 6, the provider would have said that, because that meant they were on dialysis. So when you look that up in the alphabetic, our code is I-12, and then there's always a decimal in CM coding after the first 3 characters. So here we have I-12 decimal 9, and that is our directive code, because we have no other subterms to look up. This is as far as it goes. So now we're going to take I-12, and we're going to go to that tabular list, and you're going to find that in the tabular list. And it's located in chapter 9, because that's diseases of the circulatory system, which includes hypertension. And all the I codes are in that chapter. So now that we've located I-12 in chapter 9, the way you want to do that is first you want to find those first 3 characters. This is probably the easiest way to do it, is just look for I-12. And then under that will be indentations of additional characters that give more detail to the code. So if it were just regular hypertension without renal, that code is just I-10. But now here we've got kidney involvement. So now it changes it to an I-12. But here we have to add 9 in order to match the description. So this is where we check the code. Under the I-12-9, you're going to find multiple descriptions, what we've called the code description. So if you can find the one that matches the #1 problem list diagnosis, here it is. It's called hypertensive. This is where you have to kind of translate renal hypertension to hypertensive renal disease, NOS. NOS means not otherwise specified or unspecified. So because our problem list did not specify it, then that code description matches our diagnosis. So I-12.9 is the correct code. So let's go to problem list diagnosis number 2. Again, we're going to start with that alphabetic index. So this one is just straightforward hyperlipidemia. And again, it's on the patient problem list, needs to be translated to a billable code as the provider will be addressing this problem. So our main term, our only term, is hyperlipidemia. When we look that up in the alphabetic index, the directive code we're given is E78.5. So as you look at the documentation, there is no subterm indicated, not even unspecified or NOS. So this is just straightforward hyperlipidemia. And the directive code that we're given is E78.5. So that's the code, the directive code we're now going to take to that tabular list toward the back of the code book. This is found in chapter 4 in the tabular list. These are focused on endocrine, nutritional, and metabolic diseases. So when we look that up, you start by finding the first 3 characters, which are E78. And then again, once you find that, you're going to look at the additional codes indented until you find your directive code of E78.5. So now this is where we have to, in the tabular list again, check the code. So under the E78.5, you're going to find multiple descriptions again. So see if you can find the one that matches hyperlipidemia. And we'll note that E78.5 is just hyperlipidemia, which is, there's no other specification. So that matches our diagnosis. So E78.5 is the correct code. Okay, now let's go to problem list diagnosis number 3. And this is just straightforward hypertension. So here again, you have to translate this into a billable code. We're going to start on the alphabetic index. The main term, because there's no other subterm indicated, will just be hypertension. And so we start looking that up in the alphabetic. So once you locate this term, the directive code is I10, because in our documentation of the problem list of hypertension, it does not indicate any other organ involvement like we talked about before. There's no heart problems, no renal kidney problems. Plain hypertension that is not connected to anything else is just I10. That's the directive code you're given. No subterm. So now we're going to take that I10, and just so you know, the other thing I want to mention here is hypertension can also be called essential hypertension, primary. Providers can use different descriptive words with it, but if it's still just say it's essential hypertension, essential just means that's it. It's just stands alone. So that's why it's essential is not technically a subterm. So now let's take our I10 directive code from the alphabetic index, And let's go to the tabular list. And this, we're going to go back to that chapter 9, because that's focused on circulatory diseases. And you're going to look up I-10. So here, we again start with those first 3 characters. This code, however, is what's called a valid 3-character code, which means you use only those first 3 characters. No further characters are used. So in medical assisting and physician offices, you would see this code a lot. A lot of people have hypertension. You know, they may not have any other organ involvement. They may not have it tied to any other underlying disease. It's just hypertension. And that's I-10. What I do want you to be very aware of, if you ever see them using like an I-12 code or an I-11 code, when all there is regular hypertension, that would actually be overcoding, because you're adding in other problems that aren't there. Or if you are having to code hypertension with heart disease and you use I-10, then you're undercoding. That's why you really have to watch the problem list documentation. So this is a valid 3-character code. We look it up, you know, in that chapter 9, the code description is essential or primary hypertension. And so our code description matches the I-10. And again, if there was organ involvement, you would move to these other code categories. But here, hypertension, essential primary is I-10. Let's look at problem list diagnosis number 4. This is a family history of colon cancer. Now, this is technically not a diagnosis, but it is what they call in coding additional history information. And it's usually put in the patient problem list. For example, if the provider is ordering a colonoscopy or even a Cologuard, this code, which is a Z code, proves medical necessity for a preventative procedure. There's no diagnosis involved, but the provider has ordered a preventative procedure, and a Z code, which is chapter 21, is going to prove the information needed to say why this is being ordered. So you still have to treat it like a diagnosis code, and it is considered a diagnosis code. So here, our most general term out of that diagnosis is history. It's a history of something. Now we're going to look at our subterms, because now we have to look at, okay, what type? Is it a family history, a personal history? Those are your options. It's a history of what? Of cancer. Remember, we call it in coding a malignant neoplasm. And the location is colon. However, the colon is also called the large intestine, but it's also a digestive organ. So now it's a little more complicated as you're looking in the alphabetic, because it could be under large intestine, it could be under just digestive organ, but most likely it's not going to be under the word colon, because that's tends not to be a CM medical term we use. So sometimes you have to get something that's synonymous with that as close as you can. So here in the alphabetic, the directive code is Z80.0. So now we're going to take that directive code and we're going to go to the tabular list. And this is way in the back, chapter 21, that's all those Z codes. And these are used, again, to prove medical necessity. Another example of it would be, you would see this a lot in medical assisting if somebody comes in for a preventative vaccine of any type. That is just a Z23 code. That means this is an encounter for a vaccine. Some of the Z codes get more specific as the type, but the Z23 is the most frequent. I just want you to be aware of that. We're not coding that today. We're going to use that Z80.0. Say the provider ordered a Cologuard preventative test. So now we go to the tabular list, chapter 21, locate that code. Again, you want to start with the first 3 characters, find Z80, and then you're going to look for the next character, which is 0. There's no indication of any additional characters needed. Now, again, we're going to check the code. So when we look at the Z80.0 code, you're going to find that the code description of family history of malignant neoplasm of a digestive organ, that matches the description. So Z80.0 is the correct code. Okay, hang in there. We almost there. We have 2 more diagnosis codes to find, and these aren't too difficult. So let's look at problem list diagnosis number 5. Again, we're going to start in that alphabetic. This is called atrial fibrillation. I think on your quiz it's going to say atrial fib. A lot of providers may call it that, but when you're looking up in the code book, it's fibrillation. So our main term, the most general term, is fibrillation. So we're going to look that up alphabetically in the alphabetic list in that index. Our subterm, which will be indented underneath, it is atrial, or it also gives the option of auricular. It can be either word means the same thing. I mean, it pertains to the same code, whichever word is the subterm. Ours is atrial, so that matches. And what that means is that this is a previously established diagnosis. So there's no further subterms. So the directive code is I48.91 for atrial fibrillation. So now we're going to look that up in the tabular list. And again, we're back to chapter 9 that has the diseases of the circulatory system. Start with the I48, find that first, and then locate underneath of that indented. You'll find an indented code I48.9. But when you read the code description, it is fibrillation or flutter. So we're not specific enough yet at I48.9. We have to make it more specific because this is fibrillation and not flutter. And it is unspecified, or NOS. So I48.91 is our most specific code. So the code description, when we check it, is unspecified atrial fibrillation. That matches our documentation of atrial fib that has no further specification. So that is the most specific, correct? and legal code to use for billing. Okay, our last one is aortic aneurysm less than 2 centimeters. Now, this one has a little variation, which we'll talk through as we look it up. So our main term is the most general term for the diagnosis, which is aneurysm. So we go to the alphabetic and we look up this term. The subterm underneath of it, indented, is aorta or aortic, either one. Ours is aortic. If you'll notice, there's no option for less than 2 centimeters. The reason being is in a diagnosis code, that part of the code, that part of the documentation is not taken into consideration in a CM code. Now, if something is done to that aneurysm, and you have to do a CPT code, that information is taken into consideration in a CPT code. That's why it's there. But you're not going to find that as a subterm in the alphabetic. So basically, all we're looking up is aortic aneurysm. So when you find that indentation under the main term, the directive code they give you is the I71.9. That's the code we're going to take to the tabular list. So again, we're in chapter 9, and we're going to locate the I79 first, and then we're going to look underneath in those indented code options and find I71.9. So this directive code includes our unspecified subterm, but we have to know that it is without rupture because that's a choice in the coding. But because it's not in the documentation, that then will match because there's no indication it's without rupture. So now under the I71.9 code, the code description says aortic aneurysm of unspecified site without rupture. So even though that's longer than our documentation of aortic aneurysm, that code is correct because site is not included. It does not say it's a rupture. The reason it says it that way is because that will say to the billing company, we understand the site is not indicated. We understand that there is no rupture, and those are not factors in the code. That way, the insurance company knows that you looked for those things because those are critical in medical necessity coding, and you found that they weren't there. So that's why it's important to match that code description, even though it's a little wordier, has more indications than what your actual main term and subterm have. So therefore that I71.9, our code is accurate, most complete, and legal. So take time to finish up, pause and kind of look through that code book as needed. And we've come to the end of our presentation, and I hope you all enjoyed getting to get a brief introduction to an ICD-10 CM code book. And I just want to let you know, I wish you all the best in your education and future careers. And it was a pleasure to do this presentation, and I hope you have a little bit more in-depth understanding of those of us on the financial side of what you will be doing as you go into the workforce. So thank you for your attention, and good luck to everyone.